Thank you for joining us. This week, we're excited to bring you a webinar from Onramp Media on the topic of the alignment between Bitcoin and military veterans. This webinar, hosted by Cam Stromme, Onramp's head of private wealth, features current and former U.S. service members Wes Lippman, Bratcher, and David Thayer. The conversation explores the natural alignment between Bitcoin and military veterans, highlighting the similarities in worldview, idealism, and the desire to change the world for the better. The guests discuss the parallels between the decentralized nature of the military and Bitcoin, emphasizing the importance of self-sufficiency, resilience, and preparedness. They also touch on the role of veterans in translating their skills and experience to the workforce and explaining Bitcoin to larger society. Bitcoin and the military share common values of accountability, self-reliance, and independence. Bitcoin promotes construction over destruction and constrains government's ability to wage war. It also enhances a country's hard and soft power through economic growth and fiscal discipline. Veterans can find a renewed sense of mission and optimism within Bitcoin. Now, time for the show.
Hello, and welcome to a special Independence Day edition of Onramp Media. I'm Cam Stromme, head of private wealth here at Onramp, and today I'm joined by three friends, Wes Lippman, Bratcher, and David Thayer, and we're going to be discussing the topic of Bitcoin and veterans. One which I'm very excited to have this opportunity to share because I think the analogies are apt and there is a lack of great content and education. So very excited that we have these three gentlemen joining us today. Some introductions for the three of them, and then we will jump into the discussion. Wes Lippman spent 4 years as a logistics officer in the Marine Corps, medically retiring in 2008 after an IED injury during a 2006 deployment while commanding a convoy in Anbar, Iraq. Wes is a senior product manager at Verizon, focused on their enterprise security portfolio. Prior to joining Verizon, he worked at a management consulting firm at PwC and IBM, as well as for the U.S. government. He holds an MBA from the University of Virginia and a BA from Dartmouth College. So Wes has authored an article entitled Bitcoin and Veterans, A Natural Alignment, which was the inspiration for our discussion today. And we'll be publishing this article at our website at onrampbitcoin.com under the research and insight section. So highly encourage anybody who's listening to this to go take a read of that on your own time as well. Bratcher is the president and founder of the Texas Blockchain Council. The Texas Blockchain Council is an industry association with more than 100 member companies and hundreds of individuals that seek to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin and blockchain innovation. I've been to this conference many times. Lee holds an outstanding gathering every year. Highly recommend you consider attending this year's summit, which will be held in Dallas, November 20th and 21st. Lee is a captain in the U.S. Army Reserves, working as a tech scout for the 75th Innovation Command that supports Army Futures Command. Formerly, Lee was a political science professor at Dallas Baptist University, teaching international relations with a research emphasis on property rights. Lee was awarded a master's in international relations from St. Mary's University and is in his 6th year as a PhD candidate at UT Dallas with a research emphasis on blockchain land registries. David Thayer is an executive advisor to the Blackstone Group, having served until 2022 as a partner. Prior to this, in 2005, David had co-founded Harvest, a family of funds investing in energy infrastructure, which was purchased by Blackstone in 2017. For 20 years, David had also served as a tanker, scout, and infantryman in the U.S. Army Reserves, most recently commanding a well-known armored cavalry unit based in Philadelphia. A former board chairman of the Moving Picture Institute, he currently serves on the advisory boards of Students for Liberty, the Atlas Network, and the Global Liberty Institute. David is a graduate of the Wharton School, the London School of Economics, and the University of Chicago.
At Onramp, we believe that Bitcoin will be the most important asset to own in the 21st century. Our multi-institution custody solution is the safest and most secure way to ensure that your Bitcoin remains in your and your family's possession for decades to come. Multi-institution custody maximizes security and minimizes counterparty risk, leveraging Bitcoin's native properties to eliminate single points of failure that have historically complicated Bitcoin ownership. Onramp provides peace of mind for your Bitcoin journey. For more information, check us out at onrampbitcoin.com.
So gentlemen, thank you so much again for joining me today in this Independence Day week. And Wes, I'd like to start by reading the opening paragraph from your article. Although it's not something you hear every day in the world of Bitcoin, there is a natural but perhaps underappreciated alignment between military veterans and Bitcoin. Initially, this may appear counterintuitive, given the role the military, specifically the US military, plays in supporting the current fiat and petrodollar system that Bitcoin seeks to disrupt. But that relationship is a strategic one. Viewed at the individual level, the alignment makes more sense. So Wes, would love if you would kick off the conversation for us and help to share the genesis of this article, why you wrote it.
Absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. Really honored to be on this panel today. And then the genesis is really, I think it was the 2021 Bitcoin conference, maybe. I think maybe that's where we initially met. I was there with my brother. And I saw some people posting afterwards, hey, good to see other Marines that are into Bitcoin or something like that. And it just really got me thinking. It sparked something where it was like, there's definitely a natural overlap between at least large parts of these two communities. And there seems like a lot of just, similarities in worldview, in sort of optimism to a certain degree. And I started thinking maybe they could do a panel discussion down here at the next conference, or maybe I should just put these thoughts down on paper and try to articulate them. And so that's what I ended up doing. It's not a long article, but I just wanted to kind of articulate some of the thoughts as to why I think those two overlap. And, working from kind of the higher macro type level down into we'll call it the tactical details, I think one of the things that is underappreciated, and again, I speak mostly for the US military just because I don't really know the other militaries all that well, but is this kind of sense of idealism and hope that the people who enlist in the military and that the people who find Bitcoin for the right reasons and become heavily involved in Bitcoin share in common. And it is that idealism and hope. And it's really just as simple as, I think, both groups, whether they fully understand what's coming in the future or not, or they fully understand all the implications, made the choice to delve into those communities because they wanted to, change the world in a positive way. Whether that be trying to, defend your country and defend the principles upon which it's founded. And we'll get into whether or not that's actually true, but, or just, fix the money, fix the world, and try to get the world towards as closer and closer as we can to a Bitcoin standard or something like that. So that was really the impetus behind it, is just seeing, at least, at the initial level of diving into these two communities, how much their overlap there was in terms of idealism and kind of trying to change things for the better.
Really well said. David or Lee, had you started over the years, as you had become more interested in Bitcoin and learning more about it, had you started to make some of these similar connections?
Well, plunge in first. The answer is no. But then once I read Wes's article, it all kind of snapped into place. And I would completely agree with the points that he was making. I mean, there are several points, as anyone who watches this, and I hope ultimately reads the article will learn. And by the way, I should have mentioned, anything I say is not a reflection of Blackstone's policies, but of course my own opinions. But in any event, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe, Wes, you can expand upon some of the points I made in the article, but I have noticed that within the service, it's been my experience that, to my surprise, there is sort of a pro-freedom, we'll call it libertarian. You would expect a conservative, but it's more kind of pro-freedom, a little bit sort of anti-establishment streak than I would have expected. And I mentioned earlier that when I was still in uniform in the 2000s, there was a huge degree of support, not only anecdotally within my peer group, but even statistically for Ron Paul, over and above the other candidates. I think this is in the 2008 election. I think that's reflective of the sentiments that that Wes brings out in his article. And I think a lot of people on the outside looking in may not expect that. I didn't in the military, but it did kind of shine through. And one of the things that I would posit is that, especially if you're in a combat arms unit, a lot of these guys have seen action and have realized in real time on deployment how ill-conceived a lot of these missions frankly are. And that may be kind of letting the cat out of the bag, but I think we've seen retrospectively how dumb Vietnam was and how dumb, frankly, some of the other missions have been over the years. And, at great cost to the guys who are actually serving. I mean, Wes is here having experienced some of that firsthand, tragically. So credit to Wes for having bounced back from that. But, I mentioned earlier as well, and I'll just kind of end with this anecdote, that when I was deployed myself in the Balkans, a lot of the guys in my platoon, I was a platoon leader at the time, would ask me, "Hey, sir, why are we here?" And, we were given talking points, the kind of issue. But by that time, it was completely quiet in that area of the world. And we were just there on this sort of like make work peacekeeping mission. And amongst the leadership, we often were wondering ourselves why we were there. So I think, just to kind of wrap this up, the themes that I think Wes brings out, I'm reminded, by the way, of the famous piece that a guy named Smedley Butler wrote. He was a Marine Corps general emerging for World War I, was "War is a racket." And it sounds a little radical to say that, but I mean, a lot of guys who are in uniform ultimately kind of reluctantly come to that conclusion. And there are noble efforts, but some are really kind of misguided. So there is that pro-freedom instinct, and that is very much aligned with Bitcoin. And Wes will get into some of the other points he makes, but until you said it, Wes, I hadn't kind of fully kind of made those mental connections. So I'm grateful that you wrote the piece.
Yeah, I'll jump in there too. And like David, I have to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I am still an Army Reserve officer, so obviously this conversation is fully in my civilian capacity, and nothing I say today is to be construed as if I'm speaking as an Army officer. So I think I had started to see some of the threads that Wes so eloquently pulled out in his article, mostly, I think, from two different areas. One was just from what David alluded to, which was sort of the ethos and the worldview that seemed to align between the military community and the Bitcoin community. I think the other piece that may be a little bit less obvious was kind of this concept of economics. And I think people in the military they probably lean more Austrian in their thinking, and they don't know that. They probably never heard of Austrian economics, but just their experience on the ground leads them to be more interested in sort of that those components of economics that are derived from theoretical understandings and experiences of the world, and rather than sort of the Keynesian view that really you're conflating a lot of information when you're piling a bunch of data into models, and you're losing a lot of the explanatory value of some of that data. And so that's more often, I think, what we would say like the armchair economists, or those that haven't been in business or really don't understand how business works. I think people in the military tend to count experience and like observation more highly than perhaps an over-reliance on big data sets that is oftentimes disguising like what is actually happening on the ground. And so that's another thread that I have long thought connects, again, like I said, Austrian economics is not a very widely known school of thought, among anybody, including among veterans. But I think the principles that flow through that strain of thought and also the Bitcoin community are quite aligned.
Well said.
Yeah, that's very well said. I didn't think of the economic angle. It's like the old saying, there are no atheists in a foxhole. There are only Austrian economics followers in a foxhole, right? Because it's the ultimate, and I'm far from an expert, but it's generally the idea of actions and consequences, right? Open market, actions have consequences, and you're not, in combat, you're not going to respawn. You can't just start over and add liquidity to yourself and have a second try at it. It is what it is, and you have a one-time shot. So even something as simple as like with Bitcoin in general, I think that's true, but something as more tactical or personal as if you send the wrong transaction, like you're not getting it back. You can't, there's no second chance. So I do like that parallel.
No alibis, right,
Yeah,
Wes?
no alibis.
Um, so, yeah, and your decentralization theme also reminded me of a story that Stephen Ambrose described in one of his books about the war in Europe in World War II, and he had mentioned that I'll try and keep it short, but nonetheless, there was a German prisoner of war who had been taken behind American lines, and he marveled at the extent to which Americans would get involved in like solving problems. So, unlike the German army, which is much more hierarchical, like if they were trying to fix a Jeep, like an NCO or even an officer would get in and try and help with the fixing of the Jeep because they didn't have time or the resources to call in the mechanics to fix the Jeep. It just needed to be fixed. And and then furthermore, I'm sure everybody on this call is aware that one of the reasons the D-Day landings, which we just commemorated a few weeks ago, were so successful is that Hitler was asleep and everyone was afraid to wake him up, and the German command was not willing to issue an order until they got approval from Hitler, and so there they were paralyzed as we're like invading the beaches of Normandy, and the American army is much more decentralized and therefore more successful, and that is a very Austrian theme, is this localized knowledge. Hayek wrote about it, and it is the key. It's the absolute key to success, I would argue, in any endeavor, military or otherwise. But yeah, it very much aligns with what you were describing, Wes.
As someone who's never served in the military, this concept or this understanding of the military has been the most eye-opening for me. The extent to which the U.S. military is decentralized and relies on that for its success. The first time that I learned about that, when I was previously with Unchained Capital, Parker Lewis led a book club, and we read Extreme Ownership as one of the novels by Jocko Willink. So he's talking about, especially in these high-performing teams, that decentralization is crucial for all the reasons that I'm sure are intuitive to you all and that you could elucidate on. But I not probably naively or stupidly had this idea that if you were attracted to the military is because you liked the hierarchical structure, or that made sense to you, or that was a fit for your personality. But then realizing that there are all these folks like Jocko in there who are this of rebellious nature, of independent, free thinking, very spirited. Well, that then when I thought deep about that makes sense. But then drawing those parallels to Bitcoin about decentralizing control and decision making, and how that actually, of course, creates a much stronger body of a unit of an entity as well. And then the parallels there to Bitcoin are very apparent, of a stronger decentralized monetary system versus a more fragile and in its own way volatile centralized fiat system.
Yeah, for sure. In my experience, even doing it, I think I went in with the wrong idea. And I'd say the parallels, I'll speak for the Marine Corps because that was my experience, and they have a very, obviously, strong history, strong brand, strong ethos. They take a lot of pride in it. And that would be almost, all the stuff you go through in boot camp or officer candidate school and everything you learn about the foundational aspects and the history of it. That's somewhat akin to like the Bitcoin protocol. It is what it is. It's written in stone kind of thing. And then after that, everything's decentralized. So you have something to which you can decentralize against, that everybody kind of recognizes as the rule set, as to some degree. And then after that, that makes it actually ironically easier to decentralize because not everything needs to be explained, and you can start layer twoing on top of that because that the foundation is what it is, and it's kind of written in stone. So, to me, there's the obvious aspect of decentralization, which is like, you're not going to concentrate all your troops in one place because an artillery round is going to take out the entire unit. That's the same idea. You're not going to, do Ethereum for the same reasons, metaphorically speaking. But that's kind of the obvious one. Having nodes running all over the world is great, but it was also just this idea of, from a market standpoint, it's a lot better to be decentralized in the sense of it allows information to flow more freely and to have everybody make better decisions. So imagine, to David's point, with Hitler being asleep and everyone had to come to him, like if you had, take Jocko, for example, in Ramadi as a battlefield commander, and he probably makes this point directly, there is no way he could sit there and have every major decision come through him. It's inefficient. It leads to bad results, deaths, in the market, it leads to market inefficiencies. And so there's really almost no other proper way than to have things be decentralized. And then I guess there's a discussion about, to what extent, and that can be done on a spectrum. But I think the principle of decentralization is, as it relates to obviously the military, but also to Bitcoin, is so key because it allows for the best information and the best decision making.
That's right. Actually, Wes, your description there, I think, is important because it's not, obviously everyone in the military would know it's not like decentralized all the time. There's like command and control, and there are the hierarchies that Cam, you would envision. There's no question about that, but it's almost like the frame on the picture. So if you have a protocol, which is sort of Bitcoin terminology, or standing operating procedure in military terminology, that's the frame. And then the picture can be painted by, ideally, in the military, sort of the NCOs, as during a battle, they're sort of, directing fire and so forth, or, perhaps even more decentralized than that if you're in a foxhole, as you were mentioning earlier, Wes. But, Lee, you're still in the military now. I'm sure that's been your experience. It also depends on which branch of the military. If you're in combat arms, there's probably a little more leeway or special ops even more so, to kind of do things your own way. But nonetheless, you kind of need both. So it's not to overplay the decentralization hand, but I think it actually makes it even more analogous to Bitcoin because, as you just mentioned, Wes, there is a frame within Bitcoin that is, in a sense, not really centralized, but we do have an existing protocol or SOP. But within that, and this gets to your layer 2 point, we can kind of play around and make our own artwork, as it were. So you kind of need both, and that makes it even more analogous, I think, to the military. Lee, has that been your experience too? I mean, you're still doing it, so.
Yeah, I think you brought up the NCO core, which I've learned a lot from great NCOs. I'm sure you guys have over the years, and they're I think a more flexible, decentralized example than perhaps when you get up into the higher echelons of I'll just say bureaucracy, if you will, in the military. Right. So I do think that the principle of decentralization is more apparent at those levels because it has to be more flexible there. And then just like any large organization, efficiency as you go towards the top is sacrificed in return for other things. And I think there are things that Bitcoin sacrifices in order to maintain its decentralization and security. And so you're sacrificing a little bit of scalability. And I think that's okay when you're talking about an asset that wants to be money and wants to be one of the largest commodities in the world. Security and decentralization are paramount. So I think that was a good trade-off. And then, just like when you move lower down, when you move into layer 2s or Lightning or Liquid or whatever on Bitcoin, you have a little bit more scalability, a little more flexibility. But it doesn't really exist. That scalability and flexibility doesn't really exist on the layer 1 on Bitcoin itself. And so I don't know, I just as we were talking, I came up with that analogy, or I think I really pulled it out actually from what you guys were saying. Y'all were the ones that built it. And so I resonated with that analogy that y'all shared, I think.
Speaking on this concept of some of these tactical overlaps, as you called them, Wes, self-sufficiency and resilience. So I'll pull out a piece from your article. Expect to self-rescue. There are no bailouts and second chances in combat, just as there are none in Bitcoin. Resilience and self-sufficiency are paramount. Wes, why would we want to create a monetary system that has no bailouts and where self-sufficiency and resilience are paramount? That sounds like a difficult system to live in. Why can't we create one where there's infinite bailouts and there's we can go running to to someone to fix our problems if things go awry?
Right. Well, I think first and foremost, because it reflects reality better, right? I mean, that's just the nature of the world. Sure, there are bailouts and you can do them in all aspects of life, very much so in the financial world, but at some point they run dry, right? And I think, who knows, it's not a macro discussion necessarily, but at some point it looks like, not to pick on the US, but even the world governments, like it's getting, that the running dry part is coming pretty soon. And I think like on the self-sufficiency part, to me, this was the part where, and it's hard to speak, I've said this before, but it's hard to speak on behalf of the Bitcoin community. It's huge and varied, and it's hard to speak on behalf of the military because it's also huge and varied. But there are some kind of generalities you can state, and I think the self-sufficiency and resiliency part, I think the veterans understand reality as it is, and they don't want to have things sugar-coated. And if there's a bad situation, they want to be able to look at it, address it, and do what they can to ameliorate it and fix it for themselves and their unit. And so I think Bitcoin is a great example, right? Expect to self-rescue. If you're a military, if you're in the military now and you've been in, say, 18 years, and you're doing 2 more, if that's even still how it works, to get your pension, and you're planning on, the United States government taking care of you via pension, yeah, you'll get it, but it's going to be probably in diluted dollars over the years. And so this idea of expect self-rescue, like you need to take action yourself to ensure your future and your family's future and not be reliant on, the government or anybody else to bail you out, basically. And that is particularly true as someone who's on a fixed income, like a retired military veteran, but obviously that goes for everybody else as well. You should. I think the other one was no one's coming to save us. It's up to us, right? That's both those lines are from the same company. They actually put them on T-shirts. It's called 30 Seconds Out by some former special operators. But I think both of those are just really apt. Like we need to build our own future. No one's coming to save us. To the extent we're saved, it's going to be by what we can do, and obviously using Bitcoin heavily as like the primary tool in that, I think makes a ton of sense.
Exactly. It's like I was reminded when reading that that a riff on one of the points you made, I guess it is self-sufficiency and resilience, is preparedness. So like if you're preparing for a mission, you already have laid out your supplementary fighting position, your alternate fighting position. You have like extra junk in your ruck to dole out to the other guys, maybe some extra ammo, whatever it might happen to be, to ensure that you're fully prepared for the mission at hand. And Bitcoin's the exact same thing. Like you get into the habit of thinking ahead and wargaming what might go amiss during the course of the mission, and it becomes, I think, a habit of mind. And so yes, I absolutely believe that it's very much aligned with the folks I've met in the Bitcoin community who are thinking 3 steps ahead instead of about, hey, what I just got my paycheck, let's blow it on having a good time this weekend. And instead they're squirreling it away and making some sacrifices now so that they can build a future for them and their families. And that is so aligned with what I've seen in the military.
There's another concept that comes to mind as we talk about this, which is the transitioning veteran that transitions back into the workforce, who has a tremendous level of skill and that they've gained through experience, and perhaps has challenges translating that skill into what it should look like in the workforce. And so the military veteran often becomes sort of a liaison, translator, translates their leadership skills into whatever that job is in business, finance, or what have you. And then veterans that are in the Bitcoin community have a similar challenge, probably a challenge that they're used to, which is explaining Bitcoin to a larger, society that is not really understanding what it's doing or how it works or what some of the value propositions of it are. And so maybe transitioning or veterans that have left the service that are now in the workforce have some experience at translating that to the larger populace. And I think that's something that we do a lot of times as Bitcoiners is we're kind of coming in as the underdog in each conversation, as if we sort of need to explain or disrupt the status quo. And the veteran that's leaving the service and going into the workforce has a similar challenge, explaining, it's sort of incumbent on the veteran to demonstrate that their experience is relatable to the job that they're applying for. And so I think veterans don't shy away from that, and therefore they make good Bitcoin evangelists too. I guess that's my point in saying that.
I had not thought of that at all, Lee, but I'm reminded that when we were still in uniform, you still are, but that we were all told like every soldier is a recruiter. Don't just rely on your recruiter to kind of recruit for the unit, and the same's true here. Like it's really incumbent upon us to, as Bitcoiners, recruit for the community, as it were. It's not just good for Bitcoin. It's not just good for the Bitcoin price. It's good for society. And yeah, so I agree. I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. We need to be recruiters for the cause.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I my background, there weren't a ton of people I grew up with or went to school with that went to the military. It was somewhat, there were some, but it was somewhat unique. Just being from kind of Connecticut outside New York, it was actually a very finance heavy place I grew up. And it was funny, like I'd come home at 23, 24 with a pretty rudimentary knowledge of how the military worked. And I'd get questions from people who were very successful, made a ton of money, and not to pick on them, but sometimes, friends' dads or whatnot. And you're like, you didn't know that? Basic stuff that I probably even knew before that, because it was just two totally separate worlds. So that resonates with me in the sense of like you're a liaison and kind of a spokesman or spokesperson for each side of that equation. Because I would also, I had some experiences in life that a lot of my Marines didn't, and I would try to teach them some stuff from, quote unquote, the other world. And so being that bridge between the two worlds, I think is exactly a very good description of the military side. And clearly in the Bitcoin world, that's what you're doing. If you even have a rudimentary understanding, but are committed to Bitcoin, like you're doing that all day, every day with anytime that topic comes up, for sure.
Whether you've been buying Bitcoin for years or just getting started on your journey, our multi-institution custody solution is the safest and easiest way to custody your Bitcoin. With Onramp and our partners at BitGo and CoinCover, you can sleep soundly at night knowing that your Bitcoin is safe from exchange failures, the loss of seed phrases, and broken hardware devices. Onramp's multi-institution custody solution eliminates any single point of failure, distributes counterparty risk, and minimizes required trust, all while providing greater assurances that a client's Bitcoin is secure and auditable on-chain. As a client of Onramp, your assets live in a multi-sig vault controlled by 3 distinct entities, none of which have unilateral control. Onramp provides products and services that honor our clients' ownership and control of the underlying asset. To learn more about multi-institution custody, check us out at onrampbitcoin.com.
How do you all think about the notion of accountability as it relates to veterans and Bitcoin? Wes, this is one of the topics you called out, and it is tangential to the topics we were talking about, self-sufficiency and resilience. Wes, you say Bitcoin is extreme financial ownership. Taking control of your money, your time, your future, your family's well-being, and ultimately your private keys is the ultimate expression of personal financial accountability. So I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this topic of accountability.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to what I was mentioning before in terms of something like there are not really do-overs in Bitcoin per se. Like you send a bad transaction, it's gone. There's a fixed supply. People make bad decisions, around Bitcoin, like what happened in, what was that, 21 with the 3 arrows and all of the stuff we all know about. You know, with Bitcoin itself, there was perfect accountability. All the accountability shortfalls, I'd call it, were kind of tangential or in the orbit of Bitcoin itself. Yeah, I think it kind of goes into proof of work as well a little bit. I think there's some bleed over there in terms of proof of work, proof of stake. Proof of stake, there tends to be less accountability. Obviously, proof of work it is accountable to the laws of physics and thermodynamics and the laws of nature, and math. And I think one way that I would describe it with veterans that's easy for them to understand is if you take someone like a tier one operator or someone who's won the Medal of Honor or something like that. You don't just spin that up, right? You didn't just create a Medal of Honor token and go get it. Like there was proof of work and accountability involved there, right? Like you don't get to SEAL Team 6 or their equivalent in the Army just by showing up, right? There's a huge amount of proof of work that goes into that. And so I think that aspect of, accountability and proof of work and how the two tie together, I think especially with people who have achieved kind of elite status or, stuff like that in the military, I think would resonate with them really well. Like, I don't just get to come be your peer because I decided that day that that's going to happen. There is a ton of, energy expended to do that, just as there is with proof of work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add, but he's absolutely right. I mean, I love what he just said about you can't just spin up a Medal of Honor, right? I mean, it is the ultimate proof of work, and furthermore, using that analogy, they're witnesses to these acts of heroism. There's no question that in this case, not to kind of beat a dead horse when it comes to this metaphor, but there's no question that this heroic deed occurred, and that's what's neat about kind of bringing it back to Bitcoin is that there are no as he was saying, Wes was saying earlier, there are no do-overs. In the military, we call it an alibi, which I referenced earlier. Nothing's phony, no bailouts, hey, Citigroup as an example has been bailed out, like a dozen times since it was found. Like the whole thing's absurd. Of course, it's all at taxpayer expense. In fact, it's not even, taxpayer expense doesn't even do it justice because it really comes at the expense of the currency. And whether you're a taxpayer or not, and only about half of us are, it comes at everyone's expense, every single citizen's expense. And so that's just profoundly unjust, and it's phony and it's fake and it's not genuine. So I really like what he was saying earlier, and it's an excellent point to be made. Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the closer you get to situations that are existential and stressful, the more in tune with reality one gets. And Bitcoin is obviously very concrete. That's an ironic phrase to use for an asset that's digital. But what I mean by that is the finite number, the proof of work consensus mechanism. There's just so many things that ties it to, a very tip of the spear, real world, concrete concept. And, when you're in the military, you can't just generate extra of some resource to accomplish your mission, right? There's no, extra pallet of ammunition if you're under fire, or there's no extra med kits if you've got people that need tourniquets, right? So you're working with what you have, and you use your resources accordingly. I think in terms of Bitcoin, there's a similar sort of very precise accountable piece where there is no way to manufacture hash rate. There's no way to manufacture more Bitcoin or double spend Bitcoin. It just has that finality and concrete nature to it.
In your guys' experience, and Wes, you said it well, that we're talking about two large cohorts here, so it's hard to make generalities. But so maybe speaking to your personal experiences and the other veterans and service members you've served with, do you think that a lot of folks join the military because they do already value these topics of accountability, self-reliance, independence, freedom? Or is it, what I'm thinking, or what I'm trying to drive at is, in Bitcoin, what I see in my community is like a lot of people are drawn to Bitcoin because it represents these ideals and principles that they like, of truth, of accountability, of self-reliance. But then it also helps to transform that individual, and certainly myself. You're trying to level up and become even more self-reliant and even more accountable, and taking more ownership over the actions within your control and your family unit and your friends, and extend those circles out. So we'd love to hear a little bit, talk about like that. What kind of aspects do you see drawing of the military that draw folks in, and then how does that potentially evolve and change them as they're going through the boot camp and into active duty?
Let me just quickly chime in with one thing, although it's just going to be quick. I think a lot of guys join, in my experience, a lot of guys will join the military for reasons that evolve over time. So in other words, they join for one reason, and then, the reason for sticking around kind of evolve. And so they might think in the case of the Marine Corps, at least, the uniform's kind of fancy, and maybe I'll pick up girls, or whatever it might happen to be. But but I think obviously there are nobler motives too, and I noticed that in particular after 9/11. But you get what I'm kind of driving at here, and I think in Bitcoin too, a lot of people, again, just in my personal experience, are drawn to Bitcoin because, hey, gee whiz, this might be a way to make some money, and it seems like a decent investment. But then once you're in Bitcoin, you're like, oh man, this is so much more than an investment. This is a community. This helps reinforce sound values. It helps reinforce your perspective on the world. I mean, I could go on. We all know this, but it's almost like, in that sense, it is also a metaphor or a parallel, because I think guys will sometimes join the military for reasons that may then differ as over time as to why they then stick around.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd almost put it into two camps, like there, especially in a volunteer military, which is obviously what we have. There's the people who have to join for any number of reasons, right? The kind of cliche one is like go to jail or join the military. But then there's the people who join for some flavor of idealism. And I think Bitcoin's kind of similar. There are people who join for the quick buck, or because they, for whatever kind of non-idealistic reason they might join. And then there are people who join for the ideals. And I do think what you were saying, Cam, is definitely true. There's sort of a self-selection process going on. Like, in my experience, the people who joined for some type of idealistic reason to the military did hold those principles, like self-reliance and accountability, and doing something beyond just your self-interest and all those kinds of things. They did it. There was a self-selection process among people who thought that way already and joined. And I think those who joined Bitcoin for even somewhat of an idealistic reason, I think the same holds true for sure.
Couldn't say better than that. So
okay, let's dig into what I think is the meatiest aspect of this, which you really address in the first paragraph, or the first section rather, entitled Idealism and Hope. Bitcoin has a better chance at ushering in an era of global freedom and democracy than bombing countries or nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan ever did. Ironically, if it reaches its full potential, Bitcoin drastically reduces the role of militaries worldwide. So I think for the four of us, we can pretty readily understand the cause and effect there, although it's probably a third or fourth order separated, or degrees of separation. How do you guys think about that? Like, how does a new native internet money translate then into changing the nature of combat and kinetic warfare?
I mean, I can give you my take on that. Well, first of all, I think Bitcoin promotes construction versus destruction, right? At the national level and at the individual level as well. There's the obvious one that, a hard money standard like Bitcoin would constrain government's ability to wage war. Just on its face, that's kind of the most straightforward one. And we were chatting a little before we hit record, and we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Dutch central bank and the English central bank were set up, hundreds of years ago specifically to finance war. It wasn't like a ancillary benefit. It was the main and core purpose of why those kind of founding central banks were set up. And I'm sure there's examples in history before that, going all the way back, to the ancients. But and it's pretty obvious to see. I mean, 1914, we go off the gold standard, or I'm sorry, 1914, we established the Fed. And for the next 100 years, I mean, anybody who's paid attention to any history has had some of the most bloodiest warfare ever. And I don't think it's, they're definitely connected, the two, the ability to print that money. And I think in general, also, maybe a lesser appreciated one is, if Bitcoin kind of takes hold and thrives in a country, El Salvador might be a great example. Some of these other smaller countries around the world that have less influence, that's true hope for those people. Us going there, and even if it's well intentioned, smashing things up, having this sort of paternalistic framing of like, we're going to help you get on your feet. It's kind of the ultimate way to have them bootstrap themselves into prosperity. And obviously, I think that prosperity and hope beget more prosperity and hope. And so, at the individual level, putting the governments of these countries aside, I think people are less inclined to be violent and wage war, and probably more inclined to try to build once they know that there's a future that they can actually build on, and there's a money that they can establish that future on. So not to be too idealistic there, but I do think, and I think that process probably takes a very long time, but I also think it's started, and I also think it's almost certainly a better way to do things than bombing places.
I've also wondered, it's not just our foreign adventures, but it's some of the domestic spending which we engage. If somebody were to go door to door to every household in America and say, "Hey, we need $5,000 to engage," or even $500 to go invade X country, the almost universal answer would be no. But so what they do instead is to print the money and surreptitiously dilute the value of the currency, which obviously works to everyone's detriment. So if you had honest money, they wouldn't be able to get away with that stuff anymore. And by the way, while we're like a dinosaur in a tar pit, kind of hung up in all these foreign adventures, I would argue that we're actually undermining our national security, because we're stretched so thin. And if we would just keep it to the wars that counted, which I think are pretty few, if you look back on American history, then I think we'd be a much more secure country. We could focus on just defending our borders and making sure our citizens are well taken care of. And with all the money we'd save, and by the way, in the process, not pissing off people all around the world with our occupations and our, beating down doors and so forth, and, bombing weddings and funerals. It's just unconscionable, some of the stuff we've done, all in the name of freedom. Then, I think we'd have a much happier populace, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. And then other countries, like in, NATO being one obvious example, will be forced to actually take care of their own defenses. One of the reasons that, not to go off on this tangent, but I will anyway, is that, Europeans have such bloated welfare states because they can. We are essentially their defense force. And I think if we force them to be more self-sufficient, they wouldn't get away with that. And I think over time, that would be good for those nations too. So anyway, I think that's just drilling down to some of the points you were just making, Wes, but I think it would be good for everybody if we could stop printing money to wage war.
Yeah, I was reading Henry Kissinger's biography by Walter Isaacson over the last couple months, and David, you brought up Vietnam earlier. I mean, that one of the tragedies in our nation's history that created unparalleled suffering both here in the country and also there in Southeast Asia to accomplish little to nothing. And I think a lot of that was, and ironically, we came off the gold standard during that conflict, right? So there's definitely some connection, I think, there that folks can draw. The other thing that I think about is hard power, soft power, economic power. We'd probably be remiss if we didn't mention Jason Lowery and some of his theorizing on this topic. I think Jason is incredibly smart and I agree with a lot of what he says. Probably not all of what he's written, but I think he's got some really insightful thoughts on this. So I want to certainly acknowledge his thinking, but also take it down from, I think he takes it very far into the future or a few steps perhaps too far. But even at the base level, when you're talking about hard power, of course, you're talking about military power. And then soft power, you're talking about your ability to influence geopolitical events, right? And you need this sort of, in a multipolar world where there's multiple countries that have power. Of course, in the 90s, that was a unipolar world. Like after 91, when the Soviet Union fell, we had over a decade where the United States was the only undisputed global power. And so we're entering a point where we're more in a multipolar world now than when we were certainly 20 years ago, when we were the undisputed power of the world. And Bitcoin plays a role, hard money in general, a sort of economic power plays a role both in the hard and soft power component. It is the fuel that drives hard and soft power. And you really can't have either without economic power. And so that's, I guess, a little bit where I differ from Jason's thinking is we're influencing both our hard and soft power through were the United States or any country really, as Wes mentioned, this is not just a privilege that the U.S. can take on. Any country has the ability to do this, to create stricter fiscal discipline, to rely more on hard assets and monetary assets like Bitcoin, and to greatly enhance soft and hard power through a focus on fiscal discipline and economic growth. And you really can't do those things while you're fighting a war like Vietnam or other wars that we've alluded to in this conversation. It just destroys the foundation of what you're trying to build.
Yeah, I would
Great
agree.
points.
I think one other thing I wanted to mention on this kind of general point is we talked about kind of the victim, and I don't like the word victim, but the people who suffer as a result of kind of U.S. military adventurism and all countries' military adventurism over the past century or so. But internally, like the actual people doing the fighting, there's a huge cost there as well, and not just financial. Like people get injured, they get hurt, they die, families are broken up. On a more philosophical basis, they become cynical. You have an entire kind of class or generation of people that become very cynical. And there are both real kind of mental and physical and kind of philosophical negative outcomes that come from this, not just for the people who war is waged against, but the people who are, in fact, waging the war. And I think it's just an important point to note. It's almost like it goes back to the motives and the ability of us to do this. I think when you have a harder money and less military adventurism, obviously those very real costs go down because there's externalities forced upon the government and decisions must be made. And a war, if you're going to go to war, it better be worth it. And I think as a result of, a harder money standard and constraining the ability of governments to kind of wage war endlessly, I do think it helps everybody, but specifically also it helps those who have kind of signed up to serve and to try to protect their country.
So true. Amen, Wes. That is so important. And, I wish that we still, in a sense, lived in a day and age when, kings would lead their armies into battle, right? So if those who are ordering us into battle from their air-conditioned offices, either in the West Wing or in the Pentagon, themselves were, or at least the Department of Defense, were themselves, in the thick of the battle, I think they would feel that pain more acutely. And as mentioned at length here, the reason they're given the liberty to do this is because they can just print the money to make it happen, and that's just unconscionable.
Print the money to make it happen, and then not have to engage in the physical consequences of it, and put their own life at risk. That's so true. That or when I was first learning about Bitcoin, started to read some of Nicholas Taleb and reintroducing for me that idea of skin in the game and how powerful that is. When you grow up, you hear all these aphorisms or truisms that, oh, okay, that's kind of a neat little dad thing that I was told at some point, or my mom told me this, but you don't. It's really powerful to have some of those truths reintroduced, and then how important those are. Another one that now I'm going off my own little tangent here, but kind of time preference. Yeah, that I was never really taught that, but I'd heard of the marshmallow test that was done. So the skin in the game one, though, that really is a powerful one. And I think that's what we all look for in Bitcoin. Who are the folks that, if they're selling products or services, do they have skin in the game here? What is their angle or intent? Are they, if things go south, will they be okay and get off scot-free, or are they taking full accountability for their actions? So going back to what you were saying, Wes, at the beginning, where military members look for really accomplishments and that kind of that track record in earning the Medal of Honor and such, that is valued above all else because of that skin in the game, and it was not sideline theorizing.
Absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, it just to kind of put a bow on this, and as we exit, the end of your article, Wes, really talks about the future and kind of tying in that idealism and hope that Bitcoin provides the ability for military veterans and service members to have a renewed mission and optimism and idealism for the future via Bitcoin, as they have had or once had with their military service as well. Would love to hear your all's parting thoughts on kind of reaching out and engaging with the military community, how they can get involved, any steps you can recommend, or again, any other reasons why there's such a natural alignment between these two communities.
Yep. I can start if you guys want. So I think one of the things I wrote was like, a lot of people say the government would be better off if there were more veterans serving. And I think that's probably objectively true. But I think also Bitcoin would be better off if more veterans were involved, just the entire Bitcoin community. And that may even be a way to affect more concrete change. I don't know. But I do think it's important to reach out to veterans, if there are veterans who are kind of Bitcoin curious, giving them resources, and honestly, the networking part too. They might want to meet some people in Bitcoin and talk to them. And obviously, I'm open to discussing that with anyone. These guys probably are as well. And I just think it's important that, especially for those transitioning out and kind of looking for the next mission, I think it's really important to support them and offer Bitcoin as a potential mission that they can kind of turn their attention to and do during kind of phase 2 of their life. So super important. I would be remiss if I didn't mention kind of 2 organizations that I've been loosely affiliated with. So one is Bitcoin Veterans, and I think the website's bitcoinveterans.org. They have a podcast as well that has some excellent hosts on, and they've really kind of grown in size from at the grassroots level. And I think they're going to be in Nashville at the conference as well, with their own kind of setup. So look for them, go to the website. It's a pretty dynamic organization. And then there's another one called Operation Bitcoin, which is run by a guy named Gabe Lord, who And that's focused more on transitioning military veterans out of the military and into the Bitcoin world and giving them some resources and some education and things like that. So I think that's Operation Bitcoin.io. But both those organizations I think would be cool for people to check out.
That's great, Wes. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Lee.
I was just going to follow on with that and give a parting thought and sort of an admonition for veterans who are interested in Bitcoin that are wondering where they can contribute. I'd say look at Bitcoin mining. I think everybody's initial thought is to say, hey, I want to be Cam Stromme. I want to work, in financial services and Bitcoin financial services. Bitcoin mining is an incredible way to utilize sort of the problem solving skills, the leadership skills, management skills. There's a lot of operational and logistical challenges that the skill sets that veterans have can be very well employed. And also that industry is hiring right now to a great degree. So I think veterans that are listening that are been in Bitcoin for a long time, maybe they have their regular job, but then they have Bitcoin side hustles, or maybe it's just their passion. And they're wanting to make that transition into the Bitcoin ecosystem or industry. I think Bitcoin mining is an undercounted and undersold portion of the industry where there's a lot of opportunity for people with those skill sets.
That's a great point, Lee. And then in the opposite direction, in other words, sort of orange pilling soldiers and sailors and Marines, because Bitcoin reinforces, I think, a lot of the values and qualities that will make them successful in the service. That's one reason alone to orange pill anybody you might happen to know in uniform. But then beyond that, and I think, Wes, you might have mentioned this earlier, it's also just a great, retirement scheme. It can provide supplemental income over time. But then because a lot of these pensions may not be all that meaningful down the road, they ought to be thinking down the road about their own futures, and Bitcoin's a great way to get them to where they need to be. So that's the least we can do to honor their service. So thanks for mentioning the mining opportunities, and then I think in reverse, we can do what we can to make sure that as many folks in uniform as we know are aware of and engaged with Bitcoin.
Well, David, Lee, Wes, truly thank you so much for your service to our country. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to extend that to all of our listeners as well that are veterans and service members. Thank you so much. And everyone have a blessed and wonderful Independence Day. Enjoy.
Thank you very much.
And to you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the show. If you found the information valuable, please share the episode with a friend or leave a rating on your favorite podcast app. All the links we discussed in today's show will be in the show notes inside your podcast app. Before we finish, a quick reminder that Onramp Media is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing should be construed as investment or legal advice. Regardless of where you are on your Bitcoin journey, we'd love to hear from you. Visit onrampbitcoin.com/contact to schedule a consultation with one of our private client advisors.